Thank you so much for coming to tonight's event. My name's Heather. I use they, she pronouns. I'm a bookseller and a gift seller here at the Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if it's your first time, welcome in. Some housekeeping before we begin. If you pre-ordered a book, it will be available for pickup at the back counter at the end of the event. If you'd like to purchase one or many, you can do that then and there as well. Just so you all know, tonight's event is being live streamed on YouTube from the iPad right there. We try to keep audience members out of frame as a rule, but if you don't want to be on the live stream, just don't walk in from the iPad. Our moderator this evening is Rajani LaRocca. Rajani was born in India, raised in Kentucky, and now lives in the Boston area where she practices medicine and writes award-winning books for young readers, including the Newbery Honor-winning middle grade novel in verse, Red, White, and Whole. She's always been an omnivorous reader, and she is now an omnivorous writer too. She finds inspiration in her family, her childhood, the natural world, math, science, and just about everywhere she looks. Thank you, Rajani, for being here tonight. Of course, our author this evening is Lisa Stringfellow. Lisa is the author of A Coma of Wishes, which Newbery Award-winning author Kelly Barnhill called one of the most promising works of fiction in a long time. Lisa writes for her 12-year-old self, waiting to be the brown-skinned hero of an adventure off saving the world. She is a middle school teacher and lives in Boston, Massachusetts with her children and bossy cat. Tonight we are here to celebrate the release of Lisa's new book, Kingdom of Dust. Through the land of Kun used to be lush and green, Amara has only ever known her homeland as a dry, dusty desert. When the griots vanished more than a decade ago, they took their magic with them, along with the goddess Owala's gifts of rain and plenty, leaving Kun controlled by a powerful and uncaring king. And though her foster mother, Zarachi, assures her that Kun is not under a curse, Amara can't help but wonder if her own origin, which is shrouded in mystery, is somehow linked to the Broken Kingdom. When Amara and Zarachi are attacked by the Umpume, the fearsome king's guard, Amara must flee, leaving all that she has known behind. With nowhere to go, but knowing that she is under a wall's protection, Amara sets off to do the impossible, find the
Hello.
So, Lisa, thank you so much for having me here to talk about your wonderful story. I was wondering if you want to read an excerpt from the book for us to start off.
Yeah, that would be great. So the novel starts and ends with a praise song. So I'll start with that. So chapter 1 is called Praise Song for Kun. O Kun, motherland of grass and sun, Owala blesses us. Where the Eke River flows through plains and soaring mountains, red clay of her heart. From hot sands of the Zare to the bright and azure seas, cradle of the goddess. From her we are born, and to her we shall return, her children, one and all. O Kun, remember the goddess, forsake not her blessings. In our past, one reads our future. O Kun, do not forget. Sung by Brio Kalichi to Eze Ikemba on his coronation, Kingdom of Kun. Chapter 2, Hope and Hunger. Dust clings to my feet with every step across the barren yard. I drop the frayed basket into the back of the cart with a thump, and I pick up one of the yams cradled inside. The last of our harvest, it's covered with the same grit that scrapes between my toes. I gently rub its bristly fibers with the worn edge of my skirt. It helps, but dust settles again, making it look as if I just pulled it from the ground. I push the basket farther into the cart and wedge it next to the pile of star apples. Lines of sticky perspiration tickle my skin and my cornrows itch as I walk over to scratch Mango behind his ears. The donkey makes a soft snort and puts his face close to mine. Hot breath tickles the skin above the crescent-shaped birthmark on my neck. His warm muzzle feels like a kiss on my cheek. Over in our mud brick house, Zarachi kneels in silent prayer before our 2 household altars. It is said in Kun that you cannot know who you are unless you can call the names of your ancestors. Sorry. Call the names of your ancestors going back 7 generations. The altar for Zarachi's family holds her grandmother's cowrie shell necklace and a knife her great-grandfather favored. Such tokens are necessary to recall, honor, and seek wisdom from our relatives. I shuffle my feet. I could honor Zarachi's ancestors, but who am I if I cannot name my own? Cushioned by the dust, I pad silently to the doorway and listen. Oala, Zarachi whispers, bless our efforts today. She places a plump star apple, sweet and tart, on an altar for Oala, Kuhn's great and beautiful goddess of creation. A sculpted python coils in restful, coils in restful sleep among dried flowers and other gifts. The little serpent offers protection to our home and relays our messages to the goddess. When she finishes with her prayers, Zarachi raises herself from the altar and notices me. Come along, Amara, she says, it's time.
Thank you for that. Okay, so tell me how you came up with the idea for this story. Like in Otherworld Fantasy, I know this because I just wrote my own. Otherworld Fantasy is a tall order, right? So how did you come up with this story, and how long did it take you to write it?
So it is funny because A Comb of Wishes is like a contemporary fantasy set in our world, and so I did find this one a little bit more challenging to think of like another world that's not one familiar to me, or to, I had to invent basically. But it actually starts with something that happened in the classroom. I think about 6 years ago, I was teaching a book called The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi, and it's a book about a girl who is the lone female passenger on a ship across the Atlantic in the 1830s. And so I was showing my students videos and background things, and there was a commercial for Dove Beauty. They had like an empowerment series of commercials for young women and girls. And one of them is called Unstoppable. So in the video, different girls are talking about kind of like what it means to be a girl, some stereotypes. And one of the girls in the video says, girls are never the ones that save a princess in a tower. And I just thought that was like such an interesting idea. And I'm like, well, like, why not? Like, why couldn't you have a story about a girl who saves somebody in a tower? So that was like the seed of the story, like trying to imagine that. And then I have always loved fairy tales. Like I read stories like all my life, and trying to think about things like, the tower, like, Rapunzel. And so like all of those things were like kind of the basis. And so I started playing around with ideas for like, where would this story be? And automatically I always think about like settings of like, like a medieval type of European setting, because that's what I grew up with, and that's kind of like what my imagination started with, because what I was fed on early on. And so trying to find my way from that to this West African inspired story was like a fun journey, which took a while.
Yeah. And did you have to do a lot of research?
I did. So once I got the idea, I was telling Rajani that I had a wonderful session with the author Gail Carson Levine. I had signed up for a conference and was able to get kind of, they call it a red pencil session, where she read something and gave me some feedback. And I told her I was having trouble trying to think about the setting, because this medieval kind of European setting that I originally started with didn't feel natural and didn't feel like I could get into the character's head and understand. And she reminded me that medieval is a time period, not a place. And so when I thought about that, I thought, oh, well, I could set the story anywhere. And so, I'm sorry. So I immediately thought, well, I wanted to have characters that looked like me, felt like me, and so I chose West Africa, and then I started honing in on like, well, where in West Africa? And so I thought about, what were the countries that like were prominent like in that medieval time, and so part of the research was looking into like Benin and all of these places, and like parts of like Nigeria and Western Africa, just kind of digging to know like what was going on, and then creating my own version of some of that inspired by what I read.
That's awesome. Can you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about how magic works in this story?
So in the story, the griots, one thing I want to point out is griots are like real people that exist today. So in my story, they're magicians, sorcerers, but in real life, they are historians, musicians, poets, storytellers, kind of keepers of oral history. So the way the magic works in the story, though, is that the griots literally keep memory. So in the beginning of the story, they vanished, and so the kingdom of dust, Kun, is turning to dust because like they've vanished, and so the health and the prosperity of the kingdom is tied into people's memories, and so that's part of their magic. So when they play their instruments and they recite these words of like the history of like the people in the community, it literally like creates like pictures like people can see like visually like above, and when they disappear and those stories go away, people start to forget. And so everything is based on kind of like the powers that griots really have in real life, but like exaggerated and expanded to make them magical.
It's so interesting. So, I mean, when I was reading this, I saw so many parallels between this story and my book, Sona and the Golden Beast, because magic plays a big role in that world too. It's a South Asian inspired world, and literally music is part of magic. And so like in that story, there's a king who has outlawed music because he doesn't want people who live there to practice magic. And I was like, this is so cool. And then, and the idea that storytelling is like one of the bedrocks of the culture, so that if you lose the storytellers, you lose the magic, and you also don't know, like, you lose the community's magic as a whole. So it's so interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a really great parallel. And one of the little, seeds that I love at the cover, which was illustrated by a Kenyan illustrator, Michael Mikura Mwangi, who also did A Comb of Wishes, is that he put in some of those things with like the instruments. So down at the bottom, you see a kora, which is like one of the traditional instruments of a griot, and there's like a balafon, which is kind of like a xylophone, and so that like the instruments that the griots play in the book are real instruments that people play today, except that they create stories and magic with them.
That is so cool. Okay, so jumping off about your original setting, can you tell me a little bit about what kind of fantasy stories you grew up reading and how that has kind of affected your writing?
Yeah. So I love to read. My mom is over there somewhere, so she knows that I was reading all the time. And she, like, one of the things that my mom did was they would always buy books. And so, like, we had a set of encyclopedia of, like, stories. And so I read, like, almost the whole set, but I really loved the ones in the middle, which were, like, all of, like, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, all of those types of stories. So I've read those and loved them. In terms of like what I would check out from the library at school, I loved A Wrinkle in Time. I loved, Susan Cooper's book, like The Dark is Rising. The Chronicles of Narnia. I've read all of those multiple times. I got into a period where I was reading tons of like Arthurian legends. So just like so many of those classic books. I didn't always find a lot of characters that looked like me or felt like me, which is kind of, I think, one of my inspirations today, thinking about like what I loved as a kid and like what can I bring to writing today. But all of those are books that I still cherish, and I still have them in my classroom library.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same way. I read just about all of those too when I was growing up, and they had a huge influence on me. And yeah, and I also at one point was wondering how come girls usually aren't the heroes of the story. How come they can't do the rescues? How come it was very interesting. But so I think that also affects the way that I write things nowadays too. very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that when you do see a book where, like thinking of like A Wrinkle in Time with like Meg, sometimes they're like the unlikable character. So like, creating like a character that, doesn't have those like necessarily, they have flaws, but like not necessarily an unlikableness that somebody can root for them.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about Amara is that like, she's like, from the very beginning, she's like, I know what's right and I'm gonna stand up for it. And, pretty early on, she's like, I know what I need to do. Maybe, maybe I'll save the whole world. It's really cool to see.
Yeah, it's like she's not used to that, and so like being asked to do things that like are very uncomfortable and having to kind of accept responsibility for something that was hard for her. But I think that's something that I can relate to, like stepping into like a position where people are relying on you, and you can do more than you think you can do sometimes.
Absolutely. Were there any aspects to writing this story that were particularly challenging?
I think, like I said, coming to that area where I've decided on the right setting, that was part. And then I think also I wanted to make sure that as I was setting this story, like in this West African inspired place and time, that I also was respectful of like the cultures that I was drawing inspiration from, and not just picking and choosing things like willy-nilly. So one of the things that I did, was I had some people read and got feedback, and I even had a student of mine at school who read some opening chapters, and one of the things that she noticed was that names of characters that I had chosen, I picked some things like more on sound and not thinking about where they originated, and so she would say like, oh, this is not an Igbo name, and I was like, yeah, like I should be consistent. Like if I'm gonna kind of set this in that culture, then the names should all fit. And so, I had an email with my editor going back, I'm changing a bunch of names. Like, and here are the new names, and like, we were in copy editing, so we had to double check all of that. But it was necessary and important. So I think all of those sorts of things, making sure that details were correct and accurate and respectful and being consistent.
Yeah. Did you look up the meanings of names too? Like, do they have specific meanings, and that's why you chose them?
Yeah. So there is a glossary in the back of the book that people can check out. It's got like pronunciations of names, and it also has like meanings of names. So for example, I'm not going to try to remember everything off the top of my head. I was telling Rajani that when sometimes you write something and then you don't see it for a while, you forget what you written. But so for example, in the back, Amara means grace. There is a character, her mother who kind of adopts her, Zarachi, asks God to do anything for you and he will. So, and even Owala, who's the goddess in the book, is based on Allah, who's the Igbo goddess of creation, the earth goddess. So there's like meanings for a lot of those things that people and kids can look up in the back.
Oh my gosh. Our two books have so much. I'm not even kidding. It's right. There's an earth goddess in my book too. Like it's kind of really cool.
It's cool.
Yeah. I remembered when I started reading this book, I was like, wait a minute, was she like in my brain too? Because like it's just so wild, and I think there's something really compelling about that, right? It's about the earth goddess kind of like being the person who supports this particular land, right? And it's like so important, and especially when you're talking about medieval societies, like food was a big deal. So I mean, food's a big deal to us now, but like still, it was even more so back then. Yeah.
No, and I think it's so important, like, with all of the stories that are finally coming out, that like we have this representation from lots of different cultures, because, like in my curriculum school, I teach, we have Greek mythology, and so we talk about like Gaia and like the earth, and so I know like in the back of my head, I had this idea of part of the story being like, there's earth goddess, and but like I was like, okay, but like I want to expand beyond like what we typically think of when we think of like different deities. So
yeah. Okay, I'm gonna ask you a slightly odd question, but you can tell me about this. So it becomes apparent pretty early on that this is a chosen one story. So, because pretty early on you find out, okay, there's something unusual about her, and there's something clearly special about her, and then people try and get her, so you're like, okay. Can you talk a little bit about writing that kind of story, kind of in light of kind of Western literature and like what the chosen one is usually like?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, it is like a hero's journey, and so, there are all those stages, like, again, something that I teach my sixth graders, we look at like, there's the call to adventure, and then there's like the, rejection of the call to adventure, and then there's a supernatural guide, and all of these different things, and like, there are definitely those elements in the story, but I think the things that, are different or specific to the culture of like where it's set in, and so the value of like, or like, again, like we think about Western culture, so like connected to the written word, and like everything here is more oral and community based and like collective, like the importance of like collective. There's in the praise song that's in the end of the book, there's like a chorus that people respond to, like, let it be so. And I think that connects to me thinking about like, in the Black diaspora, like, in like churches, like, the minister will say, let the, congregation say amen, and people will speak back. So like all of that, like, is a thread through different communities, and like definitely try to incorporate that like into the book as well, like reveal the setting.
I love that. Yeah. It's so cool. So can you tell me what was the most fun thing about writing this book? I already talked to you about like the challenging part. So what's the most fun to do?
I think it actually, the story came to me faster. So the setting did not, but like the idea of like the girl going on this quest and like all of these obstacles that she had to go through. So one of the things I've done is NaNoWriMo, which stands for National Novel Writing Month, and the challenge for adults is to try to write like a whole 50,000 word novel in 30 days. And I've done it a few times. I've only succeeded twice out of like 9 attempts. And this book was actually my last win with NaNoWriMo. And it was the story that, unlike Home of Wishes, which I also did a NaNoWriMo, but I didn't get to the end. Like I won. I got a whole bunch of words on a paper, but like I didn't know how the story ended. I had to figure that out later. This one I actually did get to the end, and the end is not so different than how it still ends. So like that part of this, like even though so much has changed, like the characters don't have the same name, nothing from like where things are set was the same, but like kind of like the skeleton of the story kind of came. So that's a fun fact that it kind of came out mostly the way it is still in terms of like the structure.
That's actually really cool. I know, that's like, and it's not common.
Yeah. Like I said, this is the last one. It's been a few years.
So people sometimes talk about, I'm not gonna call it a slump, but like the challenge of the sophomore book. Was there any, like, was that true for you? Was it harder to work on this book than it was your debut?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a lot of reasons, I think, a first book, when you're trying to go through the stages and get it to, acceptance and then publication, like, there's a lot of steps and a lot of revision, and there was in this book, but it's compressed. So, this book was written, I had a first draft at the time that like Home of Wishes came out 2 years ago, but like hadn't really shown it to a lot of people. It was very rough, and so working on my editor with a deadline was very different, very stressful. As supportive and wonderful as she is, I think, and then working full time, like I didn't have the leisure of like you do with the first book, where like you don't have anybody's deadlines but your own, and this is like, okay, like when can we have this book? Like I'm working on it. So definitely, and then you feel also kind of like the anticipation of like, will this be as what I've written before, so.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel like in the days of trying to get your first book sold to somebody, like that's all you can think about, but you've like literally spent years of your life like making, like crafting every word of this novel. And then you end up, obviously you end up changing it a little bit with your editor, but it's like this precious thing. And then the second one is just like, boom, okay, revise this thing. And you're like, oh, you have 6 weeks. You're like, wait a minute. It took me like 6 years to write that one. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, I think this is a fantastic book. Yeah, it's super fast paced, nice short chapters.
Yeah.
I think young readers are gonna just absolutely go crazy for it. Yeah.
And I think, that was one of the things I worried about was I'm like, am I spending enough time with it? And there were definitely things that in the revision process that I expanded on and built on and deepened. But, I think kids are looking for like different kinds of books and some that are fast paced and exciting. And so hopefully this would be one they like.
Absolutely. What do you hope readers get from your book?
I hope so. There's there's the dedication, of course, but there's an epigram at the beginning of the book, which is a West African proverb, and I think in this time period of like book bans and such like assaults on like the freedom to read and access to read, like I think this was kind of an important thought that connects to telling of stories. But it reads, when a griot dies, it is as if a library has burned to the ground. And so kind of like the history of like the stories that we tell each other in the community, we don't want those things to be lost. And I think, it's made me ask questions more, like my mom, I have been asking her more questions lately about like, what were things like when you were growing up, and all of those things, because those are the things that when people move on, there's nobody to ask anymore, you lose them. So I think one of the things I hope young readers take is how important the past is and how it can help inform the present, and then to remember all of those things that help bring us to where we are today, because otherwise it is like losing a library when those things are gone.
I love that. Oh, well, those were the questions that I had. Is there anything else that you want to share with us before we take questions from the audience?
Yeah, no, I'm just happy to jump in and hear what the audience might want to ask.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes. Are there any like tips that you have for like starting writing?
To write. I think not to judge yourself, because I think sometimes, those of us who have perfectionist tendencies sometimes want to say like, oh, that's not good, you want to erase or cross it out or throw it away. And I think just trying to write things and not be judgmental of yourself, that inner critic, to kind of silence it as much as you can, is the most important thing. Just be playful and creative, have fun with your ideas.
And if you're stuck and you don't know what to write, or you feel like I don't have any ideas, I think fan fiction is a great place to start. Because you already know the story, you already know the characters, and you can kind of jump off from there and write your own kind of twist on things. And then, I mean, some really famous books have started off as fan fiction and then they turned into something completely different, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. Yeah, I love, and sometimes people have said like, watch TV shows and movies that you really enjoy and think about like, how did those stories make you feel, and like think about like, what could you play with? Asking what if questions too, like, what if this or that, and like play around with those ideas. So just have fun with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I loved hearing about how you share drafts with your students, and I'm curious how you share the finished book with your students, if at all.
Well, school hasn't started yet, so
Yeah,
they'll get a chance to see it. But so sometimes what I'll do is when I'm trying to model for them how to do like critiquing of their work, I'll put myself on the spot, and so I'll print out like a page and then have them, I'll say, this is what this is the kind of feedback I would like, I find helpful, have them read it and write some notes on it, and then say, okay, like, you know, kind of like what I would do in my own critique group, like, you know, give me some feedback. What did you like? What you thought worked well? What, you know, did you have questions about? And then I say, go do it yourself. So kind of putting myself out there first. And a lot of them kind of think it's cool that, you know, I get to show them something that my editor has, and they're giving me feedback that I definitely will incorporate. So.
That's brave.
Try to be.
Because kids are not necessarily gonna pull punches, right?
No. I had a student once, way back though, before I had started writing professionally or anything, but I think I shared a poem or something, and he told me, don't quit my day job. I was like, you definitely can be honest. I saw a question.
Is there anything you had to fight to keep during the editing phase with this?
Oh, that's a good question. So not really fight hard, but I had to like explain. So like in the story, there's a festival, a New Yam festival that the village is having, and there are masquerade dancers. And I know one of the copy edits came back that I said I used like a singular word, and they questioned like it should be masqueraders or something else, and I said no, it's like it's written like this, and I gave them a link to something. They were like, oh. So I think like things that are culturally specific, sometimes, you know, people who are copy editing just look at like what the, you know, the typical, you know, Western rules for things are, and so having to explain, and you know, you do as an author get that option to they call it STET. So like when you're editing and they suggest a change and you don't want to make that change, you can just say STET and then tell them if you want to, like why or why not, but STET is fine.
It's a very cool word.
Yes. Yes, Pam.
Are you taking a break, or what are you working on now?
I am kind of in a little bit of a spinning around on a story or two. So I have an idea for something that I'm trying to work on, and I'm also playing around with a picture book idea. So that was kind of my way of like, okay, I'm feeling frustrated with this novel, so let me maybe work on something a little bit different. And so those two things I'm kind of playing with right now. But the novel is another middle grade fantasy, kind of leaning back more into horror, which I know a lot of people are surprised that like A Comb of Wishes got classified as horror, because it's got some scary mermaid stuff in it. So this next story, if I get it finished, is a little bit more horror.
Yeah.
What's the best advice you've gotten from an editor?
Best advice. I think, you know, that you don't need to worry about like what the rules say about things. Like I was worried about this book and the other book about things like word count or how long something should be, or you know, just other things that like you hear is like, you know, oh, you should do this or that, and them saying, you know, you don't have to do that. You can do whatever you want and whatever works for the story. So kind of having that freedom. I know, like, for example, in A Comb of Wishes, I started off with a narrator who's like the mermaid, who's a 300-year-old antagonist. And that was a rule I heard, like, you should always start with the main character, the kid character, because that's like how the students are going to be able to, you know, relate to them. And I tried that, and it didn't work the same way. And so, you know, I found books that broke that rule that worked great, and so kind of having to be, you know, brave and say, you know, I think I want it this way, and just sticking with it.
Anyone else?
Yes.
What was it like doing NaNoWriMo during the school year?
Really hard. But I actually do it with my students, so they kind of carve out a part of the class time in that month, and I try to write with them while they're doing it. I don't always succeed, because a lot of times they'll have questions and then I don't get as much writing done as they're getting done, but so yeah, so I kind of, when I started NaNoWriMo, and I found out that there was a young readers or young writers asked that, I was interested in that, and I said, if I'm going to make you guys do it, I'm willing to do it too. And that's been a fun thing about building community of writers in the classroom. But yeah, I find that Thanksgiving vacation is a huge catch-up time for me. So. Thank you guys for all
Thank
these
you.
questions. That's awesome.